Okay, before I flip the camera over, I'm going to put my rewind shaft in place, so I've got somewhere to hook this rubber band around the shutter release shaft so it doesn't fall out. If that falls out, then that little T-shaped piece that I'd worked on earlier is in the habit of falling out as well, and it falls down into the gap between the bellows and the housing, and you have to end up stripping the whole camera down in order to get at it. And that you can do without exciting things like that. So I'm just assembling the film rewind shaft here, inner and outer together, a little touch of grease. And I'll put a little bit of grease in the bush. Check that that moves smoothly. It does. Sometimes that's very stiff. It'll be very stiff if the grease in there has gone very dry and hard. If it was very stiff, you would end up with too much tension on the film as you dragged it through the camera. And you don't want to be stressing film, you can end up with problems. Right, so that's in place. Just pull that up. And what I'm doing here is I'm just going to run a rubber band across here, just to hold my shutter release shaft in position so it doesn't fall out while I turn the camera upside down, and put a hinge pin in here. That's good. Now, does that open and close? It does. I'd like to say that's lovely and smooth in its action, but it's not an awful lot different than when I'd started. I'm just looking at these arms and seeing if they're rubbing as they go across. Yeah, just at this point here. That'll be fine, that'll work well. Right, so our door's on, our focus is all correctly set, the our rewind is back in place, film rewind shaft up there, tripod socket, and you can start putting back together the other mechanical components. And so I usually start with the lock lever and the release lever. So there are two holes in the casting at the top, and in the casting at the bottom. I'll lubricate those with a bit of molybdenum paste, and you don't need to do any more than leave a dirty mark with molybdenum paste. You're not sticking on a thick lather of the stuff. Pop the lock lever in place. The lock lever's job is to lock the film advance when the frame counter reaches number 1. That's a common feature of a lot of Retina cameras, and one that catches people out if they're not familiar with a Retina camera and they haven't bothered to set the frame counter. So if I see if I can pick up this little circlip here. Pop that into place. That's good. Check the action. Make sure that rises and falls correctly. Right, the release lever, so called. This one has a spring on it, I've removed the spring before I clean the parts so that it doesn't get lost or damaged in the cleaning process. And I have the spring right here, and I'll check that, look at it and make sure it's not bent out of shape in any way. It's a slightly odd shape. This spring was, there was probably 3 or 4 different shapes that they used over time. There's different people had ideas about how it should be made. Generally speaking, they all work as well as each other. This certainly doesn't look like it's going to cause me any problems. It does appear to be lacking a bit in tension there. Just straighten that out. Give it a bit more tension. How should I choose to do that? I might do it from here. That's okay. Sometimes it's tricky to get this spring seated correctly so that it sits all in one plane and isn't bending up or down. You need to swing that spring across, line up the hole in the top of the body, check that that's not trapped, that's good. Right, now I'm holding my finger on that from below to stop it falling out. The return spring goes on the top, and there's a screw, a long screw that goes in there which forms the adjustment for the shutter release, which is why it's so long. Got to get that screw started. Of course, the shaft is split at the top, which gives it the grab on the screw so that it stays where it's put in terms of adjustment. So it's sometimes hard to get that started. That's good. That looks okay. Now the shutter release at the top of its action, this screw should be below that point. It is. So that's a good place to start. Right, so where is my take-up spool and its metal bush? Now the take-up spool is plastic on this model. You can clean it with a bit of naphtha, and that's good to get rid of any old dirty grease from inside. Don't use anything more aggressive than naphtha, otherwise the plastic will melt and that would be a disaster. So I put the metal bush in the base of that. The slot side goes up to the top of the camera, and I need the film advance shaft. Now I'm checking this to make sure that this plate on the bottom of the shaft is not loose. It's staked on at the centre. Sometimes it's loose if the camera has been dropped and the film advance lever has hit the ground. This is good, there's not a problem with that. I've got to lubricate this. Typically I choose to use graphite grease at this point to lubricate here and above that bush too, and put some in the spring so that the return spring moves smoothly, that the coils don't bind on each other. So I'll put that goo on there, that graphite grease. Then normally I use my synthetic grease around the surfaces of the cam here. Top and bottom, there's 2 cams, one in one direction, one in the other. Those ratchet cams ensure that the film advance lever can only swing in the forward direction until you reach the end of the advance stroke, whereupon its swing pops up. the release lever pops up and ensures that you can only return the advanced lever to the rest position. You can't inch the lever, you can't swing it in small increments. It has to be complete swings. Right, I'll get that done. I use graphite grease on this bush because I have used it for some time and I like the smoothness and the feel of that action. The graphite grease here is quite tacky, it stays on the shaft. So I've run some into the spring, that'll work its own way around there. The graphite grease, of course, is very messy. You end up with black marks over everything you touch. Right, so a bit of synthetic grease on this little ratchet cam here, both sides. Some in that notch because that's where the lock lever runs. Now check that this is round. Where's my rest position going to be? It's going to be there. And get this into position. So I've got to feed that through the base of the camera, through the bush in the bottom of the take-up spool, and drop it into the camera. Now, just swinging this in position. I've got to line up the holes. The holes in the plate on that advanced shaft, I've got to get them lined up with the screw holes in the bottom of the camera, of course, in the casting. There are three holes. These are nickel plated screws. All of the screws here are quite clean because they've been right through the cleaning process. If you don't do that, then the screws that you'd be using there can be picked out fairly easily because they're the ones that have not had glue on them because they haven't been under the leatherette. So get these three screws in place. Make sure you don't use the chrome plated screws that hold your top cover in position by mistake, because then you'll get to the end of the job and discover you haven't got the right screws. So I'll get these three screws in place. When they're all in place, I can tighten them up. That's good. Let's just swing this back into the park position. Oh, look at that. My elastic band, the rubber band's trying to get away there. That would have caused me grief. Next piece to put together is the clutch assembly. The clutch assembly consists of three pieces: the outer gear, the inner piece here, which connects to the top of the take-up spool, and the spring in the middle. And the spring's job is to provide some tension between the two, some friction, controlled friction, so that we have controlled slippage between these parts. So first I need some synthetic grease. Oh no, graphite grease I use for this job, not synthetic, because I like the way, the tackiness, the way it stays where it's put. And now I need the other pliers. Putting the spring onto the centre part, making sure its tab is sitting in the slot. Put my pliers over that. Rotate that clockwise to pull that spring in tight. Put the outer in place, drop it over the inner, and there's the two pieces of the clutch assembled. Now they'll rotate smoother in one direction than the other, and that's fine. The direction that they move smoother is actually the correct direction. That's the direction it needs to be able to slip. The clutch is essential because if you didn't have some controlled slippage, as the film is advanced through the camera, it would build up on the take-up spool, and eventually it gets to the stage where the diameter of the the effective diameter of the take-up spool was so much greater that it would be trying to pull through more film than the sprocket shaft was pulling through the camera, and of course something would have to give, and effectively you'd end up with torn film. So by having some controlled slippage there, it allows the take-up spool to effectively slip on the shaft, whereas the sprocket is firm, that there's no slippage involved there, that has no clutch. Right, so here's our bush for the top of the take-up for the film advanced shaft. I've just lubricated that gear in there with a bit of grease. And this is held in place with two screws. One of them is the shoulder screw that also acts to support the cocking rack. It's doing that up lightly. And the other position here, what the hell's that in there? That's bizarre. Oh, just looking at the state of the spacer from the rewind button, and the washer is mutilated. I don't know why. Nothing I did. Oh, I don't even know whether you could. I'll inspect that as I get to it. I think I'll be replacing that spacer washer, because I don't think it can ever work properly the way it is. Right, so just run that screw down there. The little bush that sits underneath that little ratchet pull has the hole is countersunk on one face and pretty much squared off on the other. The squared off side should be upwards. The screw bites down on that squared off side, and if you head the other way up, it'll go down into the countersink and it will lock the little ratchet arm and stop it from moving. So it's important that that's the right way up. I'm not entirely sure why they have a countersunk end to that little bush, because it's potentially an area of confusion. So I'll just get this spring in place. This spring controls this little ratchet pull. This ratchet pull's job is to ensure that the take-up spool, the gear on the top of the take-up spool, can only go in one direction. The take-up spool, of course, itself has got a clutch in it. We've just put that in there, and that clutch would allow the take-up spool to be pulled backwards, as you would when you're rewinding the film. This gear can go in place. I usually just rotate that into position. There's a bit of dirt there. What's that from? That's fine. Checking that everything's in place there. Sometimes it's useful to put something underneath the film advance shaft at the bottom of the camera so it doesn't push down. This is a great thing to put under here. That's our cover for the back catch release. Pop that under there. It stops the shaft being able to get pushed down while you're assembling the top. So we have the spring that sits on here. This plate here. This drive dog. A washer. The gear. This is the gear that couples to the shutter cocking rack. And that's held together with a screw. I can find the right screwdriver. I'm taking care not to disturb any of this while I do the screw up. Tweak that up tight. That's that part done. So that's the film advance shaft complete, and the next thing to put in place here is the rewind button latch, and then the rewind shaft, the sprocket shaft. So I'll get that done. Okay, so let's get this in place. This is the latch that holds the rewind button in the set position when you press in the rewind button until you move the film advance lever again, which releases this lever and allows the rewind button to pop back out. So that sits in there, has a return spring, a shoulder screw that holds all this in place, check that the screw goes through correctly, do that screw up tight. Now that spring, have to swing that spring across so it's behind that tag on the lever. So I just picked it up with a pair of tweezers and lifted it across. That's how it should go when everything goes smoothly. Our sprocket shaft can go in place. Our sprocket can go in place, and the shaft here needs a little touch of grease on the shaft top and bottom, and normally I'll put a bit just on the gear on the top where it couples to the film advance. That's plenty, and that should slide down into position. Sometimes it doesn't slide easily, in which case loosen off this screw and this screw and you can pull that back slightly. You'll find that you create enough clearance for this to fit. Flipping the camera over, I'm holding that shaft with my finger from below. I can pull back that lever, push that down into position. Let's close the front of this camera here. I want to get the screw in place here that drives this on the shaft. I'm rotating the shaft by turning the take-up spool until the screw hole here comes up to the top. We have the screw there. That screw in this case is exactly the same as the two screws that form the hinge pins on the front door. That screw's not starting well. The screw may be damaged or the hole may be damaged. Let's go around the other side of the shaft and try from the other side. Of course the hole goes right through, it's threaded right through. Let's try it on this side. That's fine. Okay. Sidestep the problem there. So, the rewind button. I'll apply a bit of synthetic grease to its return spring. This is assembled with the rewind button, the return spring, and then its washer, spacer washer, and that screws on directly onto the end of that sprocket shaft. At least it should do. Right. Check that the button can be depressed. If it's not lined up with its washer correctly, you can't push the button in. So you might have to muck around with it a bit to get that to seat correctly. This one's certainly given me the run around. That's better. Right, I can tighten that up. Checking that sets correctly, it does. So that's good. So at the base of the camera we're fairly much done. Now what I just put there was a replacement for this particular washer. Now this was the one that came out of the camera and it's as ugly as, it's all mutilated. I've got no explanation for how it could come to look like that. I mean, it may have been a mistake. Looking at the shape of that, it looks like it's been hit by a press with another one of these on top of it. Because it's a manufacturing defect. It's been like that since 1959 or whenever this camera was made. It obviously functioned. It's not one that I'd put back in a camera. Alright, well that's looking quite good. Just about close up the base of the camera next.